first off, the first question that I wanted to ask was a pandemic of massive proportions. We're all seeing this, millions are infected and economies are collapsing. Did we see this coming? As an expert, did we see this coming? Did we see a pandemic of this proportion? Did we see this coming?
The world, the public health world, scientific world has been speaking out for many years now, saying that it was quite clear from our knowledge of science and of pathogens that at some point we would face a pandemic of a pathogen. I think most people thought it would be an influenza virus, but it didn't have to be an influenza virus. And the world of public health, certainly WHO and many experts have been speaking about this for quite a number of years. And so, yes, we saw it coming. We didn't know when, and we didn't know what, and we didn't know the specific nature of it, but we knew something like this was highly likely, if not certain, to happen.
What made you certain that it was just around the corner? What are the indicators in this sense?
Well, I don't think we knew when it was going to happen, but the idea that we would have pathogens, we would have germs that were going to we've seen episodes of this where germs have moved from animals to humans, and where we don't have immunity as a world to these pathogens, and so they would move from person to person, from community to community. They would cross borders and they would spread around the world. You couldn't look at the evidence of virology and other pathogens and not see that as a possibility. And we'd experienced it before. So we'd experienced it as a world. Probably the most recent example was the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. Yeah. And I think what was happening was the public health world, the scientific world, was calling on countries to prepare, to ready ourselves so that we could stop it as quickly as possible and mitigate the impact of it as best could be done.
Okay, so right now in the current scenario, how do you think is the global effort to find a vaccine for COVID-19? How do you think that effort is doing so far?
Well, there's massive, every institution that touches the possibility of a COVID vaccine has turned over its primary focus, its energy, its time, its money to finding a COVID vaccine or vaccines. I think we all believe that there will be more than one that will come forward. So the effort and the coordination, collaboration is unprecedented, really. And it's unprecedented because the whole world is feeling this. And the impact of this is across all families, all communities, all age groups. There is no sector that has been left out of this, and the urgency to move along with safety and with science and with data-driven decisions is paramount.
Right. So what precisely is the role of WHO and more specifically your department in the whole global vaccine development race?
So WHO plays a really critical role across the whole of the vaccine value chain. When a vaccine to be developed has to go from discovery, development, testing, through to an evaluation of the evidence from that testing, which results in licensure and a regulatory process so that every country can decide whether or not those vaccines are ones that they want to work with and to import. It also means that there has to be a policy. Who should get this vaccine? What should be the order of people getting the vaccine? How will the vaccine be allocated across countries? Are countries going to agree to an allocation framework? And finally, there has to be manufacturing, supply, shipment of vaccines, and country implementation. My department, which is the Department of Immunizations and Vaccines and Biologicals, largely works across that value chain, but primarily on the policy side, the strategy side of a vaccine, the country implementation, the readiness of countries to implement, and the evidence around what vaccines we should be using, and what the order of vaccination should be. What would be the highest priority groups who should receive those vaccines?
Okay, that's interesting. So Could you explain to us how this vaccine development process, as in the vaccine development model of COVID-19, how is this different from past vaccine developments?
Past vaccine developments have always centered on the health need of a vaccine. That's what really drives the decision to pursue a vaccine. The difference here is the coordination and speed with which the attention and energy and effort is being made to pull all of the pieces together. And normally we work in series. We first develop evidence around the burden of disease. Manufacturers, scientists, academics, the whole discovery enterprise works on trying to understand the genetics of a pathogen or the biology of the pathogen. And we move stepwise towards vaccine development. And not until we actually have a vaccine that is likely to be licensed do we begin the policy process. And not until the policy process is ended do we really start to implement processes for countries to move forward with a vaccine. We don't have the luxury of going stepwise at this point. We have to actually move at risk. We have to start processes and steps not knowing whether the previous steps in that chain have actually been completed. So we have to start a policy process without knowing what vaccines we're talking about. We actually have to start thinking about country implementation without knowing exactly what policies we'll have and which groups will be prioritized. So we're going to have to work at risk, and that means that some of our work will be off target, but we have to do that in order to go as fast as possible.
Okay, so is this unprecedented MO, is this going to be the new normal for vaccine development post the COVID era, or are we still going to go back to the traditional vaccine development for future, let's say in the post-COVID era for future vaccine developments? Is this going to be the new normal?
I don't think any part of our lives is ever going back to pre-COVID. And I think vaccine development will take lessons from this experience. Probably we won't implement all of the experience from this COVID vaccine development because it does take enormous resources to go fast like this. And we recognize that some of those resources will end up having been ill-placed because we don't know the finality of step one before we have to start on step two. So I think that there will be, I think the future of vaccine development is that it will go quicker than it has in the past. I think these will be some of the lessons, not only from COVID, but also lessons that we learned from Ebola vaccine development and other vaccines that have come along, is how can we go more quickly, leverage more the resources that are there, and yet maintain the highest level of assurance of safety and of impact and efficacy.
Right. Okay, moving on. There are reports that the virus is mutating and there are newer strains out there already. How broad and how adaptable do you think the vaccine development is right now so that these newer strains are accounted for in vaccination?
Every genetic organism goes through changes in its genetic makeup. That's the nature of biology. The question is not whether or not this virus is changing. The question is, are those changes ones that are relevant for vaccine development? The scientific community is watching this very closely. And at this point, the targets for vaccine development don't seem to be compromised by the changes that are happening. And remember, these changes. It's not abnormal for these changes to be seen. This is not something unexpected at all. The question always in looking at germs is, are those changes ones in the targets for vaccines, and would they alter the nature of a vaccine response? So this will continue to be watched. And remember, we've only even had the genetic code to this virus since early this year. So this is going at unprecedented pace and has to be watched over time.
Right. So the pandemic of 1958, the H2N2 influenza pandemic, it circulated until 1968, somewhere around that, and then it underwent an antigenic shift, then triggered another pandemic in 1968, right? So, and both these pandemics cost millions of lives. So And then influenza pandemics have come and gone multiple times now over the last century. Do we see the possibility that coronaviruses can do the same, of coming and going and coming and going, causing multiple pandemics over the next decades or the century?
I don't
Because
think
this is
we should
already the
take,
third. This is
yeah, I
already
don't,
the third coronavirus outbreak in the last 2 decades. So
yeah, I don't think we should take too many, I don't think we should overstep the analogy between influenza virus and coronavirus. Coronaviruses, first of all, we've had coronaviruses around for a long, long time. And coronaviruses are a known cause of upper respiratory tract infections and of lower respiratory tract infections that can be more serious. And it is the case that we've had now the emergence of some new coronaviruses, new to humans, that have not been infecting humans before, or that we're able to detect them now, whereas perhaps previously we didn't have the surveillance and the means to detect them when they would emerge. So we should not overstep on the analogy to influenza, which is a very special virus that does shift and drift in its genetic makeup. The question here is really for the coronavirus that we're facing right now, whether or not it will modify in adaptation to immune pressure from its human transmission to a point where it will now escape from whatever immunity is developed. Remember also that whenever a pathogen changes its genetic makeup, it can be adaptive and it can be maladaptive. It actually can be a shift that actually is not very advantageous for the organism, and it can no longer be as infectious or as harmful to a human. So sometimes what happens is a pathogen shifts in a way that it actually becomes less dangerous.
okay, so there is a bit of hope there. Talking about vaccine developments now, there are multiple types of vaccines, and of course there are multiple types of vaccines currently under development for COVID as well, DNA based, RNA based, etc., etc. For the layman amongst us, is each approach equal in research and development time, or is one approach faster than the other in terms of development and research?
You're absolutely right that there are different sort of categories of vaccines that are being developed. One of the interesting parts about the COVID vaccine development is some of these categories of vaccine development have never been developed as vaccines previously. So that
Like the
we're
DNA
in,
based,
and the mRNA-based vaccines. We don't
yes.
have any licensed vaccines of that type of vaccine. There are big advantages to those types of vaccines if they work. And that's part of the reason there is so much interest in them, is the ability to scale the vaccines and produce them rapidly. And we have to recognize that we will likely have more than one COVID vaccine, and they will likely be using different approaches to vaccination. At this point, none of the studies in humans have gotten to the point where any of them can yet assess whether any of the vaccines are actually working to prevent COVID disease. So we have no a priori expectation about whether one or another will be a better platform, a better style of vaccine. And there will be pros and cons of each of them. And those will have to be weighed as they come forward for licensure and as we consider the pace and scale with which they can be deployed, especially for products where we've never had a vaccine of that type before. The assessment of safety, both before licensure and in the post-licensure phase, is going to be extremely important.
Okay, so you're saying there is a high possibility that there's more than one vaccine that comes out for COVID-19. So implementing vaccination of these different multiple types of vaccines over different regions of the world, that's also something that the WHO will be coordinating. Is that so?
It will be always the decisions of countries about which vaccines they want to put into their program for immunization. That's always a country decision. WHO doesn't make any decisions on that basis. WHO will make recommendations, will provide technical information, but it's the decision of country programs for what vaccine a country would actually license for importation and implement. And we will, as a world, we will be having ever greater information about the performance of the vaccines, about how they behave in elderly people, non-elderly people. We have to consider immunization of younger people, especially children as well. So all of these considerations will be taken, will be based on whatever evidence we have. And what has to take place is an assessment of how much information is going to be needed before a decision can be made. And will the decision be about limited use so that we can gather more information, or will it be about broad use while we collect more information? So those are assessments of benefit relative to the risks that are believed to still be unanswered questions.
Okay. Again, in the implementation of vaccination globally, there's a problem that we've all been facing. Even more so in India, vaccine hesitancy or anti-vax, let's say, that has reduced the efficiency of or efficacy of public vaccination programs in India, and we're seeing a bit of that in the US as well. Are you at all concerned that such behavior can limit the potential of a COVID vaccine?
We're absolutely concerned about, first of all, what's happening in social media now, which is misinformation, absolutely inaccurate information, and outright falsehoods as well around both COVID vaccines and the life-saving vaccines, over 20 of which we have, that are licensed and well-evaluated vaccines that have demonstrated safety and impact. So we are concerned that people will take on board information that is not correct information, that is inaccurate information, and as a result may make decisions that are not in their interest from a health perspective or a healthy lifestyle perspective. So yes, we're concerned about this. We're watching and we're responding with our colleagues in social media companies, that when misinformation is circulating, that it will be taken down. It is not of benefit to anybody for falsehoods to be distributed.
You came to a very important question that I was coming to the next, misinformation, because the WHO has even termed the COVID-19 as an infodemic of misinformation, and rightfully so. So is this problem of misinformation going to affect on the other side of the table, as in scientific research and in science as well? Because the effect is there on the public domain, but is it affecting the science as well?
Well, I guess I have confidence that the processes that we have for science and for vetting of information are very solid. And that's, I'm sure a lot of your readers have heard about peer review. And what this means is that when a scientist actually writes a paper, comes up with a finding, has studied something and wants to put it out there, they actually need to have their work reviewed by other people who are experts in the field. And basically it's a criticism of the work. And that's a very healthy thing to have happen, is for people who didn't actually do the work to ask questions and to provide constructive critique of the work. When those critiques look at the work and find that it did not follow valid scientific approaches, then either the work is not published, or the work has to be rewritten and redescribed to meet the standards that we have in the scientific world. So this is extremely important. What's happening now is many pieces of work are being put out there without having been reviewed by people who were not involved in the work. So very often, and that's a good thing, to put things out there as quickly as possible so that we don't hold up the process, but recognizing these pieces of work have not been reviewed by our peers, and there may be some very serious flaws in the work. So it's extremely important that we protect that process in the scientific domain and in the way in which scientific work is published. And I think we can rely on the highest standards of work, especially those works that are published in journals that demand the highest standards. Not all journals require that.
It's interesting because in the case of COVID-19, there are cases where researches are being published without due diligence and without the sort of peer review that it would have otherwise gone through. And in that circumstance, I mean, in some cases, some researchers are coming out with absolute nonsense of information, if that is the right word to use. So is that how much of a danger is that, and how do you think we can counter that little fraction of
Well,
not so
I think
useful stuff coming up?
yeah, I think we have to rely on, most people in the general public don't read the scientific literature. They don't read what's published in the scientific journals. But what does happen is journalists, and rightly so, are translating what they're reading in scientific journals and putting it out to the general public in ways that the general public can absorb it. Unfortunately, what happens is that some media, some parts of the media, and some journalists are looking for sensationalist stories. They're not actually looking for credible, valid information. They're looking for the thing that is going to spark fear or spark outrage. That is not helpful. And it's especially not helpful when it is obvious that those reports are grounded in falsehoods. So I think it is really the responsibility at a very important, vulnerable time of our world that journalists, and especially science journalists, hold themselves to the highest standard that they possibly can, and that they're looking for credible, vetted, scientifically based information, and not sensationalism. The other thing that happens that I'd like to point out is any given report in science must be repeated. There is no report in science where we say that is the final truth, it's the only truth. And because there is variability in biology, an observation in one place, in one time, among one group of people may not be repeatable. It may not be the general truth. It may be an outlier. And so in science, we very much accept and demand that any observation that is made that seems to be a new lesson in science must be repeated by some other scientist to demonstrate whether it is a valid finding and a general finding, or whether it was an outlier.
Yeah, so I think the voice broke up in the last part of the sentence. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, so from a pessimist perspective, I mean, if we are being very pessimistic about the whole vaccine development program, is there a chance of things going horribly wrong and throwing a spanner in the works? Is there a plan B in that case? If vaccines just, because Dr. David Nabarro from the WHO, he said that it is also a possibility that there is no COVID vaccine, right? So what then? Is there a plan B?
Well, there's no vaccine until there's a vaccine. And so plan B, that we have many pathogens where we've been working to develop a vaccine for many years. HIV is an example. There has been a 30-year effort to develop HIV vaccines. And so there's no end point where you say it's impossible to develop a vaccine against this. There's the accumulation of new knowledge, there's innovation, there are new ideas about how to approach the problem. It's not a static field. So there is I'm completely in agreement with Dr. David Navarro. We have no guarantee that there will be a successful, safe vaccine in 6 months, 10 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. There is no crystal ball on that. However,
Sure.
We do know that the more shots on goal that you have, the more vaccine candidates that come forward, the better chance there is that one of them, or more than one of them, will be successful. And success is defined not just by being able to prevent disease, but it's being defined as also being safe.
Okay. So let's say a vaccine is developed and the developers and the manufacturers decide to patent the thing and go commercial with it. It's perfectly legal, but in the current scenario, you might as well, put that to the side for a bit and get the vaccine as quickly as possible out there. So does the WHO and your department ensure to some extent through its recommendations that any vaccine developed by any firm in any part of the world makes it to even the weaker sections of the economies, weaker countries without the financial burden that comes with it? Or Do you have a plan on handling that, or is it part of the whole program?
Yeah, so the question you're asking is really about fair access and
Yeah.
allocation of vaccine. And this is of primary importance to WHO. And WHO is an organization that is simply the organization of all the countries around the world. WHO doesn't stand alone or apart as an independent entity. It is the organization that every government around the world has agreed that this will be the way that governments will talk to each other, and this is the technical agency to work on behalf of all countries. WHO has no authority. The countries have not given WHO any authority to demand anything of or to require anything of independent commercial vaccine manufacturers. But what WHO does have is the right to speak, and to speak on behalf of the world and on behalf of the member countries who are part of WHO. And so equitable access of vaccines, to put the public health interests first and not the ability to pay first, is extremely important. And we're working in a coalition, in a collaboration through the what's called the ACT Accelerator to assure that we have agreements, mechanisms, and structures in place so that when vaccines are developed, that equitable access is the principle that is used to allocate vaccine, and that there are financing mechanisms to assure that those countries that are least able to pay have the ability to actually secure the supply of those vaccines for the people in their country. And I think especially for high-income countries and people in high-income countries, we have to recognize this pandemic is worldwide. You cannot close your borders. There is no interest in vaccinating only certain people in certain countries. With this virus anywhere is this virus everywhere. And so everybody has an interest in shutting down this pandemic. And to do that is going to require interventions everywhere where the virus is. We all have an equal interest in that.
So I believe we are closing in on time. So final
Yeah.
question: give us a best case and a worst case scenario for a COVID vaccine.
A best case scenario is that by the mid fall, we have
Okay.
at least one product that has been shown to be safe and effective against COVID disease, uh, and that we have a mechanism to actually allocate that vaccine. That we've got manufacturing capacity to develop the hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of doses that would be needed, and that we are moving quickly along to start to deploy that vaccine by 2021. That's a best case scenario. A worst case scenario is I think we can imagine a worst case scenario where we have neither diagnostics nor treatments nor a vaccine, and that we're still in a state where we have to use what we would call, epidemiologic principles to control the pandemic. I don't think that's where we're going to be. That's a complete pessimist view. I do think we're going to have much greater diagnostic capacity. We will continue to apply the strategies and techniques that are being used now and successfully used to shift this pandemic. But I think we all want to get back to a life that is one that doesn't require us to shelter in place and to have the level of physical distancing that has been required, and people have been enormously participatory in protecting each other. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time and all the explanations and insights.